The connection between human rights and connectivity is a relatively new issue. We are now approaching a so-called beyond access environment. What does that mean? It means that although in the majority of African countries the level of connectivity is still very low, especially in rural areas, our research and current research is actually trying to understand what are the reasons for that poor level of connectivity. And there are not only issues related to supply side, market related issues, so for instance on specifically infrastructural spectrum, broadband investments, infrastructure investments, pricing, and this kind of supply side infrastructural issues. But there are also demand side problems, and those are related to the level of education and skills of the population, to income levels that in these rural areas are very, very low. This is what we call the capabilities. And then the third component, which is also very important, is the digital rights one. And therefore, risks of privacy violation, of surveillance, of barriers to freedom of expression, censorship. Those are all barriers to connectivity and to access. That's why human rights are becoming a relevant and an important topic also in connectivity. Access to ICT and to the internet enable the fulfillment of other human rights, freedom of expression, as we said, privacy protection, safety and security. On the other hand, human rights might become the next maybe approach to internet policy and regulation. Why? Because human rights can identify, through the human rights approach, it's possible to identify what are the specialized areas of legislation that must be taken into account when you develop an internet policy framework, such as, for instance, privacy, freedom of expression, safety and security online, education, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, this specialized area of cyber legislation are all linked to access and connectivity. And therefore this human rights approach in a beyond access environment, I think is going to be quite the right one to use. For instance, specifically in South Africa, although South Africa is considered one of the countries in Africa with a higher level of mobile and internet penetration, actually the level of access and use is unequal across the South African society. So also the urban areas are well connected, the quality of service is relatively good. In rural and unperceived and economic areas, especially the cost of communications is incredibly high. And again, from a supply side perspective, if you take into account macroeconomic indicators such as the GDP per capita or the GNI per capita, and the cost of communications in baskets, you see that actually the expenditure on communication services is not as high as instead it is in reality, because when then you analyze the demand side issue of that, and therefore you grasp from the user perspective how much they pay for that, how much they spend for communication services, voice and data, you actually see that in rural areas approximately 20% of their disposable income is used for communication services, and therefore that actually demonstrates the level of inequality within the South African society. And only through policy and regulation actually you can try to reduce prices of cost to access to ICT.